and had lost its ability to borrow money. There was no market for American loan office certificates after Congress had decided to stop paying the interest on the existing debt. Commercial shipping had stopped because the British blockade seized American merchant vessels from the Gulf of Maine south to the Carolinas almost at will. So, as his terms for accepting this new position, Morris demanded what amounted to complete autonomy to hire and fire people. He wanted to make sure that the people that he brought into the government in this new department were going to be people who had the same strong commitment to patriotism and to a new national government, and were not going to be beholden as much to the states. So he wanted control of the people. He wanted control over the flow of funds into and out of the department, and he also demanded no responsibility for the existing debt. If the Continental Congress wanted to pay off the existing debt, it would have to deal with the states to raise the money. Absent taxing authority, a main challenge for Morris would be to get the states to provide any funds to run the Confederation government. And he also hoped that the American representatives in Europe could convince the Europeans to provide grants, or at least loans on easy terms. And that was not really in the cards yet, because the situation was still very much in jeopardy. So it took until March 1st, 1781, for all the states to sign the Articles of Confederation. That is, just to agree to the agreement of how decisions would be made. This is not, again, it's not an instrument of governance. It is a contract, a general agreement. The question then would be whether they would comply with the terms they'd agreed to. Payments to the Confederation government were to be based on aggregate land value plus the value of property improvements. Not an easy thing to comply with, because who's going to value the land? And how is that value going to be determined? How is the value of property improvements to be determined? This is not something that they had any, extensive civil service to do. It was certainly in the interest of each state to undervalue these assets. So, it'd be equivalent to we live in our communities, and the counties usually do the assessments. It would be equivalent to the government, our local government, saying, well, the county's not going to do it anymore. We want you to assess your own property, and we'll charge you the taxes based on your own assessment. Well, unless there's some kind of provision that says the local government has a right of first refusal to acquire your property at the amount at which you assess it, your whole motivation is to assess your property far below its true market value to lower your taxes. So the same problem here is, what's the enforcement mechanism going to be over those assessments? And there was no easy way to get around that. Then a serious blow occurred to American finances because the British captured the Dutch island of St. Eustatius. And this was a major point for American commerce. And they would be able to ship commodities produced in the colonies and the new independent states to this island and exchange those for hard money that they needed for their pay for the goods that they needed. Robert Morse, the biographer, says, many American merchant ships stopped there as they supplied the American forces with goods from Europe. British predation was severe. Goods of all sorts were taken. They also found plenty of treasure from America in the form of tobacco. Admiral Rodney hid behind the Dutch flag to fool American ships. He reported that he took 150 vessels. Some estimates put Rodney's take between 3 million and 4 million pounds sterling in 1780s currency. What a financial hit that was to the efforts by Morris and the Americans to fund the war. Financial support from the French was halted after the Continental Congress was unable to make any interest payments on its debt, and then the Continental dollar was devalued. That improved once the French learned of Morris's appointment, believe it or not. It's one person. Measures were needed to create a national economy if creditworthiness was to be reestablished. This was to be Morris's priority. Again, his biographer. A key step in realizing this vision was the creation of a protocol that would not allow for 1,000 special cases and instead would rely on one rule: the value of currency backed by silver. Instead of cooperation from the states, Morris was faced with stiff resistance. There was not a whole lot of silver in North America at the time. So how do you back the currency by silver? You have to have a lot of silver coming in exchange for the commodities that you're sending to the Caribbean, which are all being intercepted by the British Navy. So what is Morris to do? His biographer goes on. Morris's political adversaries were quick to associate his hard money policies with the monarchy of George III. This resonated with many because the king supported much of his empire with trade, and that trade relied on hard money. So a lot of resistance to what Robert Morris came up with, which was in his idea common sense, and it was the only things that were going to improve the situation. Well, the great families of the American states had derived most of their wealth as landowners and were as speculators in Western lands, that is, the land just beyond the settlements. Their economic history was attached to mercantilism, not to the policies of laissez-faire, laissez-aller, championed by the French physiocratic school and also by Adam Smith. And Smith's ideas are best interpreted as a fair field with no favors. At least that's what Henry George used to describe what Smith was writing about. Although not a solution to the funding problem, Morris was convinced of the need to establish a bank that would be subscribed by investors who would bring hard money, that is silver, to capitalize the bank. And that would eventually become the Bank of North America. His biographer tells us on May 17, 1781, Morris proposed the creation of the first congressionally chartered bank, the Bank of North America. He proposed to sell shares to the public and to capitalize the bank with 4,000 Spanish milled dollars. On the 28th of May, the Congress passed a resolution and the bank was formed. And so began the long history of debate and argument over whether or not it is in the interest of a country to have a national bank, a public bank. He goes on, Morris figured that once the states saw the advantages of hard money and the benefit of growing free markets, they would enact taxes to support the continuation of the new system. At least that's what he hoped. By this time, and based on his experience up to this point, I find it difficult to understand how he could have expected cooperation from state leaders who saw their interests as local and their newfound sovereignty as sacrosanct. They were really not willing to give up any of this sovereignty to a fledgling potential national government with powers to dictate to them what kind of laws they ought to enact. And certainly that had a lot to do with property rights, including in the South, property rights to, in fact, have an ownership of individual people. When the states failed to take action and to impose new taxes benefiting the Confederation or agree to tariffs imposed directly by the Confederation government, Morris wrote to each governor with another appeal. Once again, nothing happened. There was no concrete action. So to obtain Spanish silver coinage, he sent a ship loaded with flour to Cuba. Unfortunately, this ship was intercepted and captured by the British. So nothing was forthcoming from all that effort. Soon Morris was engaged with the French in the logistics and movement of supplies to support the new joint American and French campaign in the South. He ended up serving as the unofficial quartermaster to Washington's army as well as the French troops. Still, the states held back on payments to the Congress, and Morris had to borrow the needed funds from the French, with his signature as the co-responsibility payer. If the Continental Congress didn't pay, Morris promised to pay back the loans that he was getting. Well, some hope involved the expected arrival of a ship from France that was actually carrying silver. Um, at the time, Morris expressed his frustration over all this in a letter to General Nathaniel Greene. And in that letter, he writes that more power ought to be given to Congress is evident now to many and will probably become soon very apparent to all. The disobedience to Congress of many states and the partial obedience of others discontents every one of them, and that will in itself be a reason for enabling the sovereign representatives to enact a compliance with its requisitions. Well, without Morris's knowledge, Congress resolved to draw on the credit of the French minister, even though there was no line of credit to be drawn upon. In France, Franklin refused to cooperate with this effort. Morris then enlisted Thomas Paine to write in support of taxation as a public service. And things were desperate. Well, luckily, the silver coins finally came from France, and Morris used these to pay the troops. He later wrote, I advanced not only my credit, but every shilling of my own money, and all which I could obtain from my friends to support the important expedition against Yorktown. So here again, it's Morris stepping up and making it possible for Washington's troops to make their way to Yorktown to confront Cornwallis, while the French Navy effected a blockade so that the British Navy could not come from New York. Remarkably, the French king stepped up and backed a 10 million lira loan to the Americans from Holland. Notice the French didn't make the loan, the Dutch made the loan, the French signed an obligation that if the Americans didn't pay, which meant if Morris didn't pay, they would pay. Even so, there was no money to pay seamen, who would get paid only if there was prize money to distribute from ships captured at sea. So if you're on a Navy ship, a privateer, capturing, British ships and British merchant ships was a way to get your pay eventually once the ship was sold and the goods were sold. And Morris encouraged this as an important source of needed revenue. He wrote to Benjamin Franklin, and he summed up everything that had come and gone. He said in his letter to Franklin, a revolution, a war, the dissolution of governments, the creating of it anew, cruelty, rapine, and devastation in the midst of our very bowels. These, sir, are circumstances by no means favorable to finance. The world, then, is that we have done so much, that we have borne so much, and the candid world will add that we have dared so much. An examination of how a people scattered across a huge territory had responded to the crisis convinced him that, quote, America was too large an area to have a single all-powerful central government. And in fact, what that meant was it needed to have strong state governments. And as new territory was being settled, that territory would have to be organized with territorial governments, and eventually some provision to bring those territories into the country as a new state. All of this to be determined, but all of it on Robert Morris's mind, even though the war continued. So we have victory at Yorktown. It changed the nature of the war, but the war did continue. There was continued fighting now for at least another year. Morris sent 2 ships loaded with flour and iron to Cuba, charged with bringing back silver coins, some of which would further increase the government's ownership of shares in the Bank of North America. So capitalized with new silver coins, the bank gradually generated confidence and brought in deposits and was able to begin doing some actual business. So the Bank of North America opened in Philadelphia on January 7, 1782, in this building on Chestnut Street. And so his biographer goes on. Morris's reputation and the creation of a private bank outside the pressures of political forces made a potent combination. Together, they established that the United States government and foreign governments could rely on the notes drawn on the new bank without fear of inflation. The bank was able to make that value stick, initially on the basis of Morris's reputation, then on the silver in its vaults, then because of the quality of loans they made. So they made a decision only to do business with individuals who had demonstrated by their past activity that they were reliable credit worthiness. Here again, Morris has a vision, as did Hamilton, for the ideal, but they were also practical. They understood the pressures of the moment and what had to be done. So, it is because of Morris that Hamilton later becomes Secretary of the Treasury. And so their thinking is very much in sync with one another. And of course, it's the second bank, the first bank of the United States, and that is put forward by Alexander Hamilton. So Morris and Gouverneur Morris then worked on a plan to introduce a national monetary unit, so that this would be accepted across state boundaries. They proposed the establishment of a mint to stamp the new coinage, and Congress gave its stamp of approval on the 21st of February. For reasons not difficult to foresee, the mint was actually delayed until 1792 after the adoption of the Constitution. And in the meantime, the states had pushed as hard as possible to contribute, had to be pushed as hard as possible to make their contributions as a fair share of the revenue under the terms of the Articles. So by the middle of April 1782, Morris had appointed tax receivers in most states to try to get the states to pay their fair share. Now, how much authority they had to pressure the states, there wasn't any really enforcement provision. All they could do was cajole and call on the governor, call on the key legislators, and try to get them to understand the situation and what their fair share of that obligation would be. Alexander Hamilton had reluctantly accepted the position in New York State. He instructed them that if all else failed, they should provide the issues to the newspapers for public consumption to basically embarrass the state leaders into compliance. Well, one of the things that was going on, of course, was illegal trade with the British. And New York City was a center of that activity. And one result of this was the depletion of the Bank of North America's silver reserve. In response, the bank stopped making loans and cashing notes. Then, just in time, a new loan, a sizable loan, was approved by the French. At the same time, the Treasury was collecting and burning the old paper continental currency to reduce its supply, to limit inflation, and defeat counterfeiting. So a major battle going on to try to get the value of the currency to be stable. And, the fact that so much trade was going on in New York City with the British meant that when those notes were presented to the bank had to give them the silver. And that silver made its way back to British merchants. So, having won their liberty, Southern planters sought compensation from the British for the loss of their enslaved people that the British removed, and some of them had been resold in the West Indies. So arguments went back and forth over who owed what to whom as the treaty was being negotiated. In response, says our biographer, the British maintained that the Southerners should pay the debts owed to them from before the war. This disagreement over the payment of debts from before and incurred during the Revolution resulted in a lot of border fighting and sea battles, and eventually to John Jay's mission to England and Jay's treaties that was negotiated later. And what you think about what's going on here is almost chaos. And whatever degree of nationalist spirit ever existed, the states were now doing all they felt necessary to defend their sovereign rights. In recognition of deepening division, Morris put the plans for a mint on hold. He managed to raise some revenue from the sale of several captured ships and some supplies, but there was never enough to meet the demand for money. The states just refused to accept what Morris saw as their financial obligation to the Confederation government. And so the financial situation was precarious at best during this whole period of time. But Morris is not dismayed. He went to work on a document he titled On Public Credit. He got some input in this document from Alexander Hamilton. And his report was delivered to the President of Congress on the 29th of July, 1792. One would not be surprised that Morris stressed the importance of efficient tax policies and their administration. He wrote as follows: in every society also there must be some taxes, because the necessity of supporting government and defending the state always exists. To do these on the cheapest terms is wise. It would be wise to carry taxation to a certain amount and expend what should remain after providing for the support of government and the national defense in works of public utility, such as opening roads and navigations. So he's very much in sync with Alexander Hamilton in the encouragement of manufacturers and the encouragement of infrastructure development to spread the economy throughout the states. He tax as a way to raise revenue that would not overburden the small farmer, but would force the large landholder to incur a high cost for the idle lands. He reasoned this would break up land monopolies and increase the development and productivity of existing properties by making property available to more people for cultivation in small farms. Sounds very much like Henry George. He also called for a poll tax of $1 per year from each citizen, including those people who were enslaved. Always in the back of his mind was the nation's credit and the essential need to service and eventually retire the debt. As for the sale of land in newly acquired Western territory, Morris did not think this would raise very much money. At that point, the land was really not very valuable, and people did not have the cash to buy it for cash anyway. And so the government would have had to provide credit, which it did. And that didn't work out really well for the federal government, as a lot of those loans were defaulted on when the speculators couldn't resell the land. So, as to be expected, the states rejected Morris's tax proposals. As a result, there was no money to provide even food for the army. Morris was left with no recourse but to co-sign government notes, which meant that if the government could not pay, he would. Those involved in the slave trade opposed the taxation of imports, charging it was an attack on slavery, which it was. Well, trade with the Spanish in Cuba, again, promised some badly needed silver coinage to the country, yet this was far short of that needed to pay what was due to the army. Loans by the Dutch and the French were already overdrawn. And so faced with all these challenges to find the needed money, Morris decided to make his case by tendering his resignation that would be effective May 31st, 1783. And of course, on March 1st, he had his letter of resignation printed in the Independent Gazetteer. And of course, the result of that was to spread panic. His biographer writes, the effect of an announcement was electric. There was excitement in Congress, in the press, on the streets, and in the embassies. Morris's letter laid the blame on Congress and the states, so it was only to be expected that even his allies in Congress would find the letter to be reprehensible, even if honest. No one wanted to be blamed, even though they deserved the blame. So Morris provided a written warning to the President of Congress that loans from the Dutch and French were far less than needed, even for current expenses. Silver did finally arrive from Cuba late in March of 83, but again, the amount obtained did little to balance the books. Morris now began to focus his attention on his personal financial affairs. He entered into a partnership to acquire land for speculation. His optimism that land values would now begin to climb and keep climbing set the stage for his eventual downfall, however, as described by historian Barbara Chernow. She writes, to restore his financial security, Morris turned his attention almost exclusively to the expansion of his land holdings. By 1790, he was convinced that land values would spiral upward. The expanding seaboard population hungered for Western lands, which would also attract European settlers. Although Morris had limited cash reserves with which to finance these purchases, he still had significant domestic and foreign credit resources, and he made use of those. He had neither the desire nor the funds to develop the land and sell it to individual settlers, a slow and cumbersome process. Instead, he wanted to dispose of his holdings in large tracts to other speculators for a quick profit. And so he succumbed to that irrational exuberance over the possibility that people would flock into the untamed wilderness. At least some members of Congress were desperate not to lose Morris at this time. That said, Morris could expect no support from the landed elite motivated to protect their privileged position. Even so, his biographer says, he had much to risk by leaving because there was no reason to believe the Continental Congress would protect him from the financial exposure he had. The bank, his friends, his contracting system, and his money all pulled him back into government service, but only if Congress would support his work and limit it to settling the business of his time in office. So, despite an absence of assurances he asked for, Morris announced on May 3rd that he would remain in office in an effort to untangle his personal exposure as well as find some type of solution to the nation's skyrocketing debt. More from his biographer. As Morris was laboring to wind up the business of the Office of Finance, there were a number of matters to be dealt with. Feeding the army, paying the soldiers, selling off of the ships, closing the hospitals, settling the prisoner of war issues, administering naval justice, covering the loans, settling the state debts, raising revenue, and opening trade with other nations. That's quite the agenda for someone with no access to funds and no real power, and without any support from his fellow leading citizens. So there's little that Morris could deal with in all these challenges. And with the formal signing of the peace agreement, any cooperation from the states actually disappeared. They now thought that it was the responsibility of the national government. Well, despite everything that was pressing on him, he continued to think about the nation's future. He entered into an exchange of views with Thomas Jefferson on the nation's future money. Would it be gold and silver? What would it be, and how would you get it? He writes to Jefferson. He also disagreed with Jefferson's proposed proportion of gold to silver. Morris would worry that if gold became the basis of the currency, then it would be easily exported to England and ultimately substituted with English light gold, which was of less value. Morris favored silver as a way to keep the hard currency in America. I don't know what the process in England was, but I gather they melted down the gold coinage and included silver and other metals in it to keep the weight the same, but the content slowly debased. Well, Pennsylvania still held him in high enough esteem that he was reelected to the Pennsylvania Assembly in October of 1785. He was then appointed to attend the Annapolis Convention and then eventually the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Well, the Confederation survived until the states would finally come to a recognition that a much stronger federal authority was required to secure the future. They reluctantly yielded absolute sovereignty to laws consistent with a written constitution. The preamble to that document begins not with the words "we the states," but with the words "we the people." We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. And of course, centuries of debate would go on over what that meant to say, promote the general welfare. How would the federal government do that? What would its powers be? Morris contributed to the nation's financial solvency in an unexpected way. In declining George Washington's request that he join the cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury, he recommended Alexander Hamilton for the post. Lance Banning, the author of this book, The Sacred Fire of Liberty, James Madison, the founding of the Federal Republic, says this about Hamilton. Hamilton's design for national greatness may have been complete in its essentials when he made his first report. Certainly, his funding and assumption program was intended from the first to further major economic and political goals, as well as narrowly financial ones. Like Robert Morris, Hamilton believed that proper management could turn the public debt into a positive advantage for the country. In effect, by simply pledging that specific revenues would regularly pay the interest on its bonds, the nation could anticipate and in the very process could ensure its future greatness. Well, I'm not going to go into all the details of what happened, but the situation fell apart for Morris, and eventually he was placed into debtor's prison in Philadelphia for 3 years. He lost everything. He had gambled everything, and he basically lost everything in defense of the war for independence and the creation of the new nation. He was finally released from debtor's prison after 3 years, and lived in relative obscurity after that, and never really rebuilt his finances or his business enterprise.